Welcome to another episode of Father Michael Recommends, and today we have my favorite trilogy of all time. I couldn't just do one movie, I had to do all three, and the movie recommendation is The Lord of the Rings. If you hear something, that's Father Jeremiah's cat. And speaking of Father Jeremiah, this is Father Jeremiah. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Father Jeremiah Payne, and I'm the pastor of St. Joseph Catholic Church in Palm Bay, Florida. And 10 years ago, I was also Father Michael's professor in the seminary.
That's right. And today's a very special day because the day that this is being filmed, which is October 17th, would have been my dad's 60th birthday. And the reason why I kind of held off on reviewing the Lord of the Rings trilogy is because, believe it or not, the Lord of the Rings was the very last movie that I watched with my father before he passed away. And we've seen this movie a million times together, but it was the very last movie we saw, and we always watch movies repeatedly, but this was the very last one I saw with him before he passed away. So not only is it my favorite book and my favorite movie trilogy, but now it has a very special significance to me. So we're gonna cheer, do a little salud to my dad for his birthday.
To Deacon Carlos.
May he rest in peace.
And rise in glory.
Why don't you tell us about this, by the way?
Sure. So I like to fancy myself sometimes as an amateur mixologist. And I created a cocktail this year. Its working title, although still debated, is the Horseman's Head, after the Headless Horseman. And it is a combination of 100 proof apple bonded brandy, of an allspice dram, of pumpkin juice straight from the pumpkin, as well as cinnamon simple syrup, capturing all of the flavors of autumn, my favorite time of year.
And mine as well. Speaking of which, let me quiz you for a quick second. Who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow?
Washington Irving.
Oh, see, he didn't even skip a beat. You got that right. Which he also wrote Rip Van Winkle.
That's right.
I read that when I was a kid. So, without further ado, let's talk about The Lord of the Rings. Now, why do I recommend The Lord of the Rings? The Lord of the Rings is kind of a classic good versus evil story. And so the big picture stuff seems simplistic until you get to the details. And then you start discovering that Tolkien infused a lot of Catholicism within The Lord of the Rings. Now, we're going to primarily talk about the movies, but as you can see, we also have the book here because it's one of our favorite books. We've read it multiple times over, and we'll probably discuss some of our favorite quotes from the book. But how about I start with you, Father Jeremiah? Do you like all three the same, or do you prefer one over the other, or what's your opinion?
I love them all together. Of course, they all go together, but for me, I always love the beginnings of stories when I'm really introduced to the characters and the world is still idyllic before things begin to fall apart. And so there's nothing like, reading those opening chapters of Bilbo's birthday party, getting introduced to Gandalf and the hobbits and the world of the hobbits. And the subtle magics that are there with the wizards, and the beginning of the troubles that you hear just rumbling in the background. Always the beginning of the book just captures my heart. Although, as it captures your heart, the beautiful thing is that it holds you all the way through the end when you learn the profound tales that Tolkien wants to teach us in his world about tragedy and victory and eucatastrophe in our own world.
And sacrifice. One of the, well, let me talk about first overarching story, what it is for those that haven't seen it. It's basically the story of a hobbit, which is the meekest of all people, of Middle Earth, which is the place that this story takes place. And he's tasked with taking this ring of power that was made by a very satanic figure whose name was Sauron, which, of course, Sauron comes from the Latin saurus, meaning dragon or serpent. And he's tasked with taking this journey to destroy the ring. And the only place he can destroy it is the place where it was forged, which is Mount Doom. And so that's the overall premise of the story. It seems very simplistic, but there's a lot that goes on because there's different kingdoms, there's different characters, there's different races. You have dwarves, you have men, you have elves, and of course the wizards and all that. And then you have evil characters like the orcs, which are just profaned versions of elves. Trolls, which I just learned as I was rereading the book recently, I just learned that the trolls, when I was reading The Two Towers, is actually a perverted version of the Ents.
Yes.
Did you?
That's true,
you remember
yes.
that?
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I rediscovered, I guess you could say, as I reread The Lord of the Rings. But basically, that's what the story's about. But Tolkien, he loves to infuse little Catholic sprinkles all over, and he never went full on, letting the reader know this is the Christ figure, this is the the devil figure. Although there is a very clear devil figure here, but it's more nuanced, and that's because, of course, he didn't agree with C.S. Lewis' way of storytelling, because C.S. Lewis, his best friend, whom he converted from atheism to Christianity, C.S. Lewis liked more direct allegory. So everybody knows his most famous series, the Narnia series, where Aslan is clearly the Christ figure who's literally sacrificed on an altar and resurrects. Well, here, Tolkien doesn't do that. Tolkien will grab the figure of Christ and split his attributes among the Fellowship, which is the company of people that assist Frodo to destroy the ring. So, spoiler alerts, we're going to be mentioning spoilers here, because to discuss like the different figures of Christ, you kind of have to bring up spoilers. So, for example, Gandalf, which clearly takes its name from Castle Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence, he is that aspect of Christ that dies and resurrects. He's also a very priestly figure, I would say, too. Then you have Aragorn, who is the king / healer, because he heals Frodo as well as Elwyn later in Return of the King. You have Frodo is the most obvious example of the Christ figure. Maybe I'll let you explain why Frodo represents the Christ figure more than the other characters.
So Frodo represents, kind of the Christ suffering, sort of Isaiah's suffering servant, right? He's the least among creatures as a hobbit. He's of no worldly account as a hobbit. He is tasked with the burden, the singular burden that only he can bear, of bearing the ring. As he bears the ring, he bears the sufferings that come along with the ring until he is at Mount Doom, or absolutely spent. And even so, you see, it's a beautiful image, his friend Samwise, and it's very evident in the movie the way they construct it. Samwise, like Simon the Cyrenian, must help Frodo carry carry the ring finally to its destruction. And so I see in Frodo so much of the suffering servant.
And he has the name in the series as the ring bearer, which is very similar to the cross bearer. And his ascent to Mount Doom is essentially his ascent to Golgotha. It's really his trip up to Calvary. I've also heard, by the way, I don't know if you've heard this before, but I've also heard people describe Sam as the beloved disciple, or the beloved apostle.
Yes, yeah, because a beautiful friendship, a very masculine but beautiful friendship develops between the two, as well as Samwise's desire to do whatever it takes to help Frodo finish the journey. Yeah. Complete loyalty, a complete surrender and love to friendship, that completes the task, and that would be, that Greek idea of philia, the brotherly love of a common goal and task.
You also see that with other characters. Actually, now that I think about it, there's a lot of development of that aspect of philia. You have, for example, not just Frodo and Sam, but Pippin and Merry. That develops as the story goes along, and in a funny way, Legolas and Gimli. Because Legolas is an elf and Gimli is a dwarf, and traditionally they've always been warring factions among each other, and the friendship that they have to actually blossoms. I actually like the epilogue that's not in the main story of Lord of the Rings, but what happens to Legolas and Gimli. Did you ever read up on that?
Yeah.
Where they traveled together after everything's over, all over Middle Earth, visiting each other's, for example, in the Two Towers, they discuss how Gimli was enthralled by the mines that are found in Helm's Deep, and he's a dwarf, so he usually lives in mines or in caves and stuff like that. And he says, if we ever survive all this, I want to take you back and show you what I found in the mines in the caves of Helm's Deep. And they do, and they actually do. And in fact, they're the last ones, if I'm not mistaken, they're the last ones to actually leave Middle Earth when they take that trip to the Undying Lands. Yeah. Which is a very beautiful story, as people start off as enemies and they become best friends. So that's basically the Lord of the Rings. I highly recommend the movie. I know it's not for everybody because some people might not like fantasy. but it's the journey that's the most important in the movie. It's the journey. Some people always say, well, the eagles could have carried them off straight to Mount Doom and it would have ended the story a lot quicker. Yeah, but it's not about that. It's about growing in virtue. In fact, the whole story is about growing in virtue. We see Frodo grow in virtue with that sense of sacrifice. Sam as well, especially the hobbits that, they like to eat, drink, and be merry, essentially, in Hobbiton. We see the virtue that Theoden, because Theoden was this old decrepit man that was easily manipulated by his counselor, Wormtongue, and how he becomes the king that he was supposed to be. Same thing with Aragorn. Aragorn is the successor of Gondor, which is the main big city in the story, which is why the third movie is referred to as Return of the King. For so long he's been postponing taking the throne because he's been running away thinking that he has the same exact faults, or if I can use this term, original sin, of his ancestors, of Isildur, right, who wasn't able to destroy the ring the first time. So it's about growing in virtue, and we see that some people grow in vices. Perfect example is Saruman, who was supposed to be the head wizard, which is like kind of saying like, I don't know if you would say a pope figure, but he's kind of like the head of the bishops.
Sure, yeah.
Although you can argue that the Ents are kind of like bishops too, the tree herders. But before we go into some of our favorite quotes, is there any other thing you want to add about the movies?
I think the movies, they're beautifully shot. They're a wonderful way to introduce yourself to Tolkien's world and to his characters. Obviously, I think we could all agree that the book is, as books always are, all the richer, because literature can convey so much more than the screen medium. But for a wonderful introduction and a beautiful visualization, and I'm going to share a quote that moved me so much. It was sort of a reconstruction of several quotes in the book, but was very profound in my life, and that could have only come through the medium of the movies. So give it a shot, especially if you're not prone to want to do it. Try it anyway, at least with Fellowship of the Ring, a beautiful introduction to all of the worlds. Now,
these movies are long, so if you want to do it by halves, because we only watch the extended versions. In my opinion, it's the only way to see them. If it's too long for you and you're not used to fantasy, you can stop them halfway. There is an intermission in each movie, because sometimes it's better, it's easier for some people, like they do binge watch on one of these streaming services, than to watch a whole movie, because they are long. The first one is like 2 hours and 20 minutes. The second one is about 3 hours. The third one is 4 hours long. So these are not short movies. In fact, if you add them all together, I think they equal close to all 6 Star Wars movies of the 1 through 6, but I'm not sure about that. But they're 9 hours and something plus all together. But I do recommend them. Actually, before we go into the quotes, how about we talk about the differences, the major differences between the movies and the book?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. Some of the biggest differences you'll see is in the contraction of characters. Tolkien's world is so replete with different characters that you can meet and have time with in the book. But for the sake of the movie, you have to compress them. And so Father Michael might talk about how Arwen in the movie is a compression of 2 different elves that we meet. Glorfindel, I believe you pronounce his name, and Arwen. So that's one. Faramir is a compound of a couple different characters in the movie. He's a little bit different in the book. Some of the dialogue and some of the great imagery is taken from dream sequences and placed into dialogue, or vice versa. And many of those choices were simply made because it couldn't translate from the book well as it is. And so they had to rearrange or compress material. So, and that's where a lot of quibbles come from. And those of us who love Lord of the Rings, we always argue about one glaring omission, an enigmatic sort of character by the name of Tom Bombadil. Yeah. And Tom Bombadil was not included in the movies, to the chagrin of many and to the delight of others, depending on whether you like that character or not. But Tom Bombadil just doesn't really translate well to the visual medium in the style of the way this movie was going. So those are some of the differences that I see.
Now that you mentioned Tom Bombadil, I do want to read a quote from Tom Bombadil, because I want you to see if you can guess, at least by my estimation, who this character is supposed to represent in Tolkien's universe. So I'm going to read to you a quote from Tom Bombadil. He says to Frodo, Show me the precious ring. he said suddenly in the midst of the story. And Frodo, to his own astonishment, drew out the chain from his pocket and, unfastening the ring, handed it at once to Tom. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment on his big brown skinned hand. Then suddenly he put it to his eye and laughed. For a second the hobbits had a vision, both comical and alarming, of his bright blue eye gleaming through a circle of gold. Then Tom put the ring round the end of his little finger and held it up to the candlelight. For a moment the hobbits noticed nothing strange about this. Then they gasped. There was no sign of Tom disappearing. Now, if you've seen the movies or read the books, when you put on the ring, you become invisible to essentially the good world, right? And then Sauron, the evil entity that created the ring, can see you. But it's, in other words, you're invisible to the good world, but you're visible to the evil dimension of Middle-earth. And we see that it has no effect at all on Tom Bombadil. Have you ever heard this before of who people speculate Tom Bombadil is supposed to be?
Well, I mean, the speculation that I've heard, is the Adamic man, Adam in the garden, the preternatural man before the fall,
Exactly.
Not tempted by disordered desires or affections.
That's correct. I hear it all the time. They compare it to Adam because he's unaffected yet by sin. And the ring represents sin and temptation. And he's completely unaffected by it. In fact, he laughs at it. And he puts it on and nothing happens. So it's like, yes, it's like man before the fall. So I always thought that was interesting. And I think there's a part where he was dancing naked or something, which is very much like Adam, right? But yeah, it'd be hard to put that on, screen. You mentioned Arwen, yes. The studios, they love to introduce love stories also into movies. They think it sells. And I thought they did it right. That's more of the expanded universe of Tolkien's world that did happen. Arwen and Aragorn did end up marrying each other, and they had 2 sons. But I think they wanted to show you some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that happened with Arwen and Aragorn. And I think they did it in the right way. I mean, yeah, they replaced a couple characters to inject her into some of the scenes, but I thought it was well done. But I will say those two are very glaring differences between the books and the movies. Also, some people complain about the way Faramir is portrayed in the movie, kind of very dark. I don't know if I want to say cynical, but very suspicious of Frodo and Sam's intentions. Whereas in the book, he's a very saintly figure.
Yes.
He is the epitome or the prototypical
Yes.
version of what a saint is supposed to be. He's probably the most virtuous guy, maybe outside of Gandalf, maybe in all of the story. In fact, I'm rereading the book again recently. There's no faults in this guy. So he is like the epitome of the virtuous man. So that's a little different. The movie kind of portrays him kind of dark at the beginning and then develops into that virtuous person. I'm trying to think if there's any other differences. Galadriel sometimes in the movie is criticized for being, when she gets into that dark moment, which, by the way, her monologue that she says there in the movie is taken directly from the book. But in the book, at least to me, maybe, I don't know, I'm actually interested to hear your opinion. When I read that part of her monologue, that I shall be a queen, more terrifying and blah, 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 it seems to me that in the book, it comes across as being sarcastic. Like, yeah, if I had the Ring of Power, I'd be this, that, and the other. It comes across, at least to me, it came across kind of sarcastic. In the movie, it's almost like terrorizing. I don't know. What's your impression of that?
Yeah, my impression was, of course, when you read the Silmarillion, you get a better background for Galadriel and what's going on with her in the ring. And so it's a test for her. It's a putting her to the test. She sees the absurdity of what she would be with the ring, and she lets the power of the ring pass her by. Because the power of the ring is nothing but corruption, and her elvish destiny is far greater than what even the ring could offer. So she names what the ring could offer. She says what it is, and then she lets it pass by. And in the book, I read it as it's almost a triumphal moment of virtue, where she faces the test, much like Christ on the cross. Again, this this sort of image of Christ in Galadriel for a moment, though she more often is an envisages of the Blessed Virgin. But she faces temptation. She names it, she lets it pass. In the movie, they make it more dramatic, and she goes into this witch tone and all of that stuff. And but in the book, I think it's clearer.
Yeah. One of the things I find also interesting about Galadriel, it actually shows us that you cannot use, and Gandalf also does this too when he first notifies Frodo about the ring, and this is in the movie, that it's never good or justifiable to use something evil for good means. Because even Gandalf says, I would love to use this for good, but through me, it would create this unimaginable evil, essentially is what he says. And so there's a good lesson to be taught there that, the ends don't always justify the means. And the opposite end of that would be Denethor, because Denethor, who is the steward of Gondor, wanted to use the ring for evil means, with the intention of doing good, but unfortunately the ring is so evil that it just corrupts anybody who uses it, So I think with Galadriel, Gandalf, you kind of see that lesson that Tolkien's trying to slide in there.
Or even in the way that the mission is accomplished, right? The power of the ring to defeat Sauron, or as Gandalf reflects with Aragorn at Helm's Deep, we may have a hope. It's only a fool's hope in The Hobbit. But it's the fool's hope, right, that is in the end the victory. And what do we hear in Scripture? That the cross is foolishness to the Greeks and folly to the Jews. And so, yet the cross is the victory, not any other power.
Yeah. Which is why the journey had to occur.
Yes.
It couldn't just be, which, by the way, the eagles, I've heard this actually from Joseph Pierce, that he describes the eagles and Smeagol, Gollum, as divine providence. They're moments when God interjects his act in Middle Earth, but it wouldn't change anything really if it was destroyed instantly. You would still have Gondor run by a corrupt person. You have another corrupt person, Saruman, who's forming his own army, trying to rival, and it's more clear in the book, trying to rival Mordor, although it's absolutely stupid, because it shows that Orthanc is like puny compared to Barad-dûr, the tower of Sauron.
Well, it's like in Tolkien, in one of his letters, later on, he was talking about how the world perceives evil to be so efficient in the way that it acts.
That's true.
And yet, evil is permitted to act because in the midst of struggling against it, the seeds of goodness are sown, and the seeds of goodness eventually strangle out the causes of evil.
Yeah. So for all those haters, because when you see reviews of the movie or the books, they always say, well, the Eagles could have just taken them to the mountain and could have shortened the movie to 1 hour. It wouldn't have, I don't think it would have changed much. You wouldn't have this development of virtue throughout Middle Earth. You wouldn't have this relationship between dwarves and elves. You wouldn't have, some of these kingdoms would be corrupt. You would still have Theoden completely corrupted, and you probably would have Saruman taking over everything. So if that interests you and you want to take a sneak peek into Lord of the Rings, be patient with it. I think it's an excellent movie and an even more excellent book if you can do it, because as you can see, this is not a short book, but it's there's so much wealth to be found in those pages. And speaking of those pages, we're going to now talk, just briefly go over some of our favorite quotes from the book and the movie, because there's sometimes they overlap. I'll start with you.
All right, so I'll share at first my favorite quote, and it's become a life quote for me. In the third book, Return of the King, when Frodo appears to be dead, Samwise takes up the task of carrying the ring to Mordor and to try and complete the mission. And he's on his way, and between the stronghold and the mountain, and he's beset all around him by orcs and the armies of Sauron marching to the Battle of Pelennor Fields. And he thinks he's going to be caught, and all hope is lost. And he's sitting there waiting to die, and he looks up through the dim clouds of Mordor that are like the darkness of night, and he sees a single star. And as hobbits are wont to do, he sings a song. And the song begins, above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell. And for me, that just encapsulates the hope that Tolkien has in the midst of the world's utter disaster, and the hope that we have in the midst of sin, in the midst of the flesh, the world, and the devil, the hope that we have in Christ. Above all shadows rides the sun.
So my first quote is not going to be nowhere near as profound as that. It's Bilbo on the 111th birthday, and he's talking to his relatives and friends there in Hobbiton, and he says,
I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve.
it's just a great movie, and the way they did in the movie too is so well done. I think they did it so well in that movie. Well, following that one, I'm gonna have to do a profound one, because how do I follow Father Jeremiah with that fabulous quote from Samwise Gamgee? But I think this one's really good too. This is Gandalf. Now, this in the movie takes place when they're in the Mines of Moria, but in the book, it's at the very beginning, still in Hobbiton, and it's Gandalf saying, "I wish." This is Frodo telling first to Gandalf regarding obtaining the ring and then realizing what the ring is and how evil it is and how much evil has sprung forth from it. Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my lifetime," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." I love that quote, because we sometimes feel like we're living in such turbulent times and we wish that we weren't born into this time. But we're asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, what do I do with the time that is given to me? Even in this time, even in turbulent times. So I think that's one of the most profound quotes in The Lord of the Rings. You have another one?
Yeah, and so this one, I was telling Father Michael before we began here, this one really touched me when I saw the movie. It's an amalgamation of quotes from a dream that Frodo had when he was in the house of Tom Bombadil. But of course, because Tom Bombadil's not in the movies, this is transplanted to just before the Battle of Pelennor Fields, the final battle before the ring is destroyed. And it looks like all hope is lost. And Pippin, one of the hobbits that's with the crew in Gondor, ready to make the last stand, says that I didn't think it would end this way. And Gandalf says,
End? No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path. One that we all must take. The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it.
What? Gandalf. See what?
White shores. And beyond. The far green country. And a swift sunrise.
That isn't so bad.
No. No, it isn't.
and I remember watching that in the movie and just starting to cry, because being a religious man, being a God-fearing man, and desiring the things of heaven, that was the first time that I felt my heart swell in an affective way, to want to strive for heaven and to want to lead a life that brings me to heaven, that made me desire heaven more than anything. And it's funny because Tolkien would say that this is what the imaginative literature, what he calls sub creatio, can do, that it brings you to the gospel by way of the back door of the imagination. And I encountered the desire for heaven greater here than I had in all of my religious doings. And I sat there being a man watching a fantasy movie going, yes, I want heaven.
There's also another quote that I like, and for some reason the quotes that popped to me are like have to do with moral theology on decisions that we make in life. There's one where Gandalf is recounting the story of how Bilbo, Frodo's uncle, obtained the ring originally, and he got it from Smeagol, who's a kind of a devilish figure, but there's a reason why he plays a major role in the movie, and I'm not going to spoil it. But Frodo tells Gandalf, it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill him, because he's such a vile creature. And this is the way that Gandalf responds to that. He says, "Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends." And so it's a great lesson for us that we shouldn't be so quick to wish the death of another person. And if you've ever seen the movies or read the books, you'll see that Gollum actually played a very important role at the end. In fact, an essential role. As vile and as evil of a creature that he was, he was almost a godsend by the end, a divine providence. He actually played a major role at the end of in the shaping of Middle Earth. I'm trying to not give away too much. That's why I'm being very vague. But it's a very valuable lesson about wishing death upon others, and essentially it's a very pro-life. It's very pro-life. Actually, kind of against the death penalty, but it's a very pro-life quote. How many more do you got? How many quotes do you got?
I think the big ones I already covered, but I think like in general, I think Tolkien's world is summed up in what Bilbo tells Frodo when they're in the House of Elrond, and he has this great quote about adventure, because Frodo's kind of grieving Bilbo's now dying years. Really, he's going to grow old in the House of Elrond and then pass into the West. And he's not going to go on any more adventures. And Frodo is grieving this with Bilbo. And Bilbo says to Frodo, the adventure never ends. The part we play ends, but the story never ends. And I think it's I love that quote because, isn't that how salvation history works? At a particular time, at a particular place, God chooses to create us. He places us precisely where he means us to be for a very minuscule part of the overall history of the world. But God intentionally places us in this place at this time for a singular purpose in his overall plan. And there's no life that is unmeaningful or no life that is small, even though it's short in the grand scheme of things. We're all a word or a chapter in God's story. And even when the sprawling grandeur of the Lord of the Rings is only just a blip on the radar of the history of Middle Earth even.
Yep.
Beautiful and profound and insightful as it is, it's just one chapter in a longer story, but man, what a chapter it is.
There's also going on, like we all have a particular purpose at a particular time, and kind of tying it into my last quote about that pro-life quote, there's a part in the Return of the King where Denethor says essentially to Gandalf, I have a right to take my life. He's going to commit suicide by burning himself alive. And in the book, this is not really shown in the movie, but in the book, he tells him, no, you do not. You do not have a right to take your own life. And even Denethor was saying, like the heathen kings of old, and Gandalf explained briefly, I've read the Silmarillion as well, but briefly how only those heathen kings who worshipped Morgoth, which is like the primordial devil, that's only something that they used to do. And you have no right to take your own life. Again, a very pro-life message. There's also the description of the lembas bread, which is the food that they would carry with them on the journey. You just can't get in the movie because the way it's described in the book, it is the Eucharist. I mean, there's no way going around it. It is the Eucharist. In fact, I'll quote you one small quote because there's a whole thing on it when Galadriel gives them gifts and all that. It's around that context, but I'll just quote you a couple sentences because I have the whole quote here, but I'm not going to go through all of it. Let's see. The elves are telling them, we call it lembas or whey bread, and it is more strengthening than any food made by men, and it is more pleasant than cram by all accounts. For these things are given you to serve when all else fails. Now think about that. It's what gives Frodo and Sam, especially Frodo and Sam, the strength that they need when everything else fails. And you see that. And I love the reaction that Smeagol has to it, because when Smeagol tries it, it's repulsive to him. See, Smeagol is in such mortal sin. I mean, he's led a life of such vice that he can't even consume the Eucharist, which shows you right then and there that you have to go through a conversion experience before you can accept this, and live a life of grace. So whereas it strengthened Frodo and Sam, it was vile to Smeagol, to Gollum. I thought that was fascinating, and that part is actually shown in the movie where Smeagol tries the whey bread or the lembas bread for the first time, and he actually spits it out. And I forgot what he says in the movie. He says,
It tries to choke us!
which is very fascinating. The other thing I like about the book, and it's also in the movie, is the banter between Gimli and Legolas and how many kills they can get. I don't remember what it was that they said in the movie, but in the book in the Battle of Helm's Deep, 42 is what Gimli tells Legolas, and Legolas had 41, so beat him out by one. Which in the in the extended version, it's only in the extended version, but you see that there's that banter, and then Gimli is sitting on the corpse of a dead orc, and Legolas shoots an arrow, and he goes, "There you go. Now I have one more than you do," I think it was, or something like that. And Gimli says, "He was already dead." And he's like, "I saw him twitch. That's because he has my axe embedded in his nervous system." I thought that was a great thing that they added in the movie. Not exactly like the book, but I think it's one of those small points. Just like in the movie, I also like when Gimli tells Aragorn to toss me when they're in the Battle of Helm's Deep. That's not in the book either. Gimli does appear, but only after Aragorn and another character are fighting on the bridge to the gates of Helm's Deep. But in the movie, I like the way that Gimli, he's a kind of a comedic character throughout the movie, and I think it's very well portrayed in the movie. I don't know if I have any. I think that's all from my quotes. I would say that the speech of Theoden as they're riding into the Pelennor Fjords is very iconic in the book, which is in the movie, but in a different place. I don't know if you mentioned that earlier, but some of the quotes are put in different places in the movie. But Theoden says, "Arise, arise, riders of Theoden, fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter, spear shall be shaken, shield will be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises, ride now, ride to Gondor." I mean, when I read that, it gives me goosebumps. And it's in the movie, just in a different location, and it still has the same impact. And I'm debating whether this is my favorite quote or not, but it's actually spoiler alert, it's actually at Theoden's death, where he said now it's a little different in the book, but I'll use the movie. It's when he's dying, and he's speaking to Elwyn, which is his niece. Now in the book, he doesn't realize his niece is near him, also dying, so he doesn't talk to her. He talks instead to Elmer, which is his nephew. But he tells her in the movie,
You have to let me go. I go to my fathers, in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed.
"My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall not be ashamed." I mean, that's bringing tears to my eyes right now. Because remember, for decades, he was led to be deceived by Wormtongue, and he became this crippled, borderline evil, I would say, man. And it wasn't until Gandalf, in the movie, it shows it almost like a exorcism. It isn't until he removes that control that Saruman had over him that he's freed and he's able to be the virtuous king that he was always called to be. And I love that line where after all the heroic deeds where he redeemed himself, he says that now that he's dying, I will be in the presence of my fathers, in whose mighty company I will not feel ashamed anymore. It's very, very moving. But that's probably my favorite quote in The Lord of the Rings. But I hope you enjoyed this recommendation. I know it's a little longer than usual, but it's Is it your favorite movie? I don't know. I didn't ask you that.
Oh, it's probably my favorite epic movie. Yes.
Favorite trilogy?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So
Sorry, Star Wars fans.
that used to be my favorite until they. Well, I'm not gonna go into that, but they kind of ruined it with the sequel trilogy. But as far as trilogies go, for me, The Lord of the Rings is the greatest movie trilogy. It's my favorite book of all time, and I highly recommend it. So if you get a chance, check it out. For me, and I know I can speak for Father Jeremiah, go the extended version is the only way to go. But if it's too long for you, break it up in parts. But there's many things I think that you'll take away from this trilogy. So until next time, I hope you enjoy this movie recommendation. God bless.